Welcome to Navigating the New Normal, What's in Your Digital Funding Toolbox, Episode 4. My name is Krystle Pearson, and I am your host for today's webinar. I am extremely excited to have our panel of guests today, as they are both amazing leaders in the EdTech community and have a wealth of knowledge to share. Next slide, please. Who are we? Kajeet. We believe in digital equity and that students should be able to learn no matter where they choose to study. This, for myself personally, is a passion as a former K-12 technology director. I know with the onset of the pandemic and having to shift from in-person learning to virtual learning, tech directors, educators, teachers, students across the country were forced with having to shift how they presented instruction, shift how they presented educational topics. And it was a journey, but here at Kajeet, that is a passion of ours. We believe that no matter if the child is at grandma's house for the weekend, or if they're with mom and dad, or if they are at the library or on a family trip, or just journeying out into the community, they should be able to have connectivity and be able to learn on the go. Next slide, please. So let's get right into it. Today's presenters, I am excited to have Dr. Susan Clair here with us. Dr. Clair is the Learning Infrastructure Coordinator in the Office of STEM and Innovation at the Virginia Department of Education. Dr. Clair specializes in educational leadership and technology, program and project coordination, technical expertise in educational technology and information technologies. And I had the pleasure of working with Dr. Clair in a previous district that I worked in. And I am telling you, whether you are in Virginia or you are just in any other state, Dr. Clair is an amazing resource. So I am excited to have her here, and I can't wait to see what she will share. In addition to Dr. Clair, we have our very own Mr. Michael Flood. Michael Flood is the Senior Vice President of Public Sector here at Kajeet. And in this role, Michael is responsible for social impact, business growth, and company strategy in the public sector market. He wears many hats here, and we are excited to have him here with us today. In addition to his role at Kajeet, he is also an active member of COSN, which is a consortium of school networking, where he has served 6 years on COSN's board of directors and was recognized as COSN Private Sector Champion of the Year. In addition to his work with COSN, he has also served on advisory boards for Horizon K-12 Report, Driving K-12 Innovation, EdNet Wireless EdTech, the International Society of Technology and Education Special Interest Group, Mobile Learning, better known as ISTE. And he also works with different organizations involved in federal, state, and local policy as he partners with organizations such as COSN, CETA, and ISTE. So I am excited to have them both here. Michael and Susan, is there anything you'd like to share before we jump right into this engaging conversation?
I'll just echo your thoughts about pleased to be here and pleased to be here with Dr. Clair. We've crossed paths many times in different forums over the years, and as you said, I think whether it's the work she does for Virginia school divisions or the leadership she shows on the national stage with her counterparts around the country, always a pleasure to share the room and share the stage with you, Dr. Clair.
Thanks. And I just want to say that I really like that picture of the bus. I remember my days when I was in high school riding the bus, and I remember the seniors would automatically go to the back of the bus. And if you weren't a senior, like, you couldn't get a seat on the back of the bus. So, but our buses back then did not have Wi-Fi on them. So just kind of brings back some memories, but glad to be here.
Thank you so much. All right, we're going to start and we can go ahead and advance to slide 1, which is going to hold our first question of today's webinar. So we know that funding has been available, and even more recently, districts have received just monies, so much money, you're trying to figure out what to do with it, whether it's a device procurement plan, whether you're trying to build your technology infrastructure, the funding is there. But I've asked Dr. Clair and Mr. Flood to join me today so that we can discuss a little bit about what funding sources are currently available. So I'm going to start off with Dr. Clair. And if you could share a little bit about what you know about the funding sources, not only in Virginia, but nationwide that are currently available, and then we'll kick it off to Mr. Flood.
Yeah, so back in 2020, 2021, Virginia distributed 18 million in CARES Act funds to school division technology leaders to support infrastructure outside schools. So what we saw at that time was funding or our infrastructure move from on-site or on-premise to off-site, where technology leaders were having to support all this technology in the home of students, which was very unprecedented, right? Just kind of happened so fast. So that was a big funding stream. And then the second largest funding stream was the emergency connectivity funding, which in Virginia schools requested 93 million. And we're going to talk throughout this presentation what the impacts of that have been. What we saw was schools requesting millions of dollars to support Chromebooks, laptops, other types of network infrastructure that would support learning outside of school. So those are the two major funding streams that came from the federal side of the house, not so much state funding that caused the increase in infrastructure. But Michael may have other funding streams that he sees. I know we can talk about the ESEA title funds. Again, that's federal funding. But Michael, I'll just kind of pass that question on to you.
Yeah, sure. Thank you. So, I guess we've been doing this for over a decade now, and we've seen funding sources, that are persistent, and then we've seen funding sources that kind of come and go in the moment or in response to a crisis, as we saw with the pandemic, or maybe that come in during one administration and go away during another administration. In terms of persistent funding sources that we've seen over the years, a lot of the ESEA, title programs, we see those consistently used to provide technology that benefits students, to address digital equity, to address what we were calling the homework gap before the pandemic, and now we just think of as, educational connectivity more broadly in an anytime, anywhere sense. But whether that's Title I, II, III, Title IV-A, a number of different title programs where we've seen that funding be used. The pandemic led to some unique funding sources, certainly ECF, which you mentioned, Dr. Clair, the Emergency Connectivity Fund. Many school divisions were able to take advantage of those funds. Some were not. There were 3 application rounds, and some districts got into those, some did not. There were also a lot of funds that came out through ESSER, the Elementary and Secondary Schools Education Relief Funding, in 3 different buckets. For those who are familiar with ESSER, ESSER was funneled down from the Department of Education to the states, and then from the states down in subgrants to the districts. The districts have a lot of latitude over how they can use that, although they receive a lot of guidance from their state education agencies as well on the best uses of that. The ESSER funds, because they came in those 3 different tranches, have different expiration dates. So ESSER 1 funds had to be obligated by September of last year. ESSER 2 funds, which is about 3 times the amount that ESSER 1 was, have to be obligated by September of this year. And then ESSER 3 funds, which are about 10 times the amount, have to be obligated by September of 2024. So there's a lot of money still available in those ESSER funds. And it's worth noting that not only are most EdTech uses eligible uses of ESSER funds, but ESSER funds can be obligated for technology and services that will serve for multiple years, as long as those funds are obligated by the deadline. So there's a lot of interesting ways to use those. The Department of Education recently published a Dear Colleague letter, which was a recent update from one they had done, I think back in, was it 2010 that they published their last one? But the latest Dear Colleague letter is addressing some of these post-pandemic funding sources as well. And then I'll just add one other thing, which is some of the technologies that we may talk about, or that you may talk to Kajeet about. There may be more unique, more nuanced funding sources available that are either state level funding sources. So for example, if you're modernizing your school bus fleet and you're moving to electric buses, now you can get electric buses that have Wi-Fi built in as soon as you buy them, and you may be using federal transportation dollars that are subsidizing the electrification of school bus fleets. So there's sometimes unique grant programs out there that we help our clients locate to pay for a specific project.
Awesome, awesome. As we move on to slide 2, we want to talk a little bit about what also is available and how can we continue to address the digital divide with those availability of funds. And I know that we talk about digital divide daily, but just thinking about it from a K-12 perspective and as a district leader, I can remember knowing that funds were available, but having the right appropriate funds to address a particular subgroup. Whereas, you have so many title funds and you say, oh, we have title money, but all title monies can't be used for all different subgroups. So let's talk a little bit about what that looks like from a leadership perspective and how we can work with districts to address those availability of funds. I'm going to kick this off to you, Michael, for the start on this one.
Sure, absolutely. So I think sustainability of our education technology initiatives is the big discussion going on across the country right now, especially with some of the COVID-related programs coming up for sunset over the next 1 or 2 years. And we're talking a lot about that with districts. I'm actually broadcasting today live from the Superintendent's Conference, the National Conference on Education here in San Antonio. And of course, for superintendents, this is top of mind. They have to plan their budget cycle, for the next several years and make sure that that's lined up with what they want to accomplish. And so what we are working a lot with districts on is thinking about that sustainability in advance. So instead of thinking about what can we do with the specific funds that are available today, trying to make sure that conversation is focused on what are we trying to achieve? What is the education technology environment we're trying to create for the long-term success of our students? That may mean that during the pandemic, you had to react in the moment to get hotspot connectivity out there to people who didn't have anything. But when you take a longer view, you may say, well, maybe we should work on over the next, 2, 3, 5, whatever years, transitioning to where every student's computing device, their Chromebook or their Windows laptop or whatever, just has that broadband connectivity built in so that we don't have to think about band-aiding and finding out who has access and who doesn't. We can just make sure that every student device has anytime, anywhere connectivity, and every staff and teacher device for that matter. So it's both a matter of thinking about, as you said, Krystle, which fund sources are available and what can they be used for, and how can we braid those together in an appropriate fashion? But also, how do we make sure that we're planning for sustainability in these initiatives rather than just trying to figure it out year by year?
Right.
And I know, Susan, that's something you're an expert on in Virginia, thinking about that need to budget and think about that planning.
Yeah, I mean, and I think, schools have this expectation that, the federal and state funding is going to continue in some manner, but I really don't think that's the case. And so from my perspective, I think what schools need to do is be thinking differently. They need to be thinking creatively. They need to come up with some innovative procurement strategies to address this problem. And because if we look at the increase in the infrastructure that we've accumulated over the last couple of years, I'll just go through a few of these. We've got, one-to-one computing device programs that we never had before. So, one of my recommendations that schools really do an in-depth analysis of what it takes to sustain and to maintain a one-to-one computing device program. They really need to take a careful look at that, and then they need to work backwards on what the outcomes, what they want to see. Again, what funding streams are we going to use to address that? We've got more educational technology applications that we know are not being used on a daily basis. Schools have purchased these educational technology applications. Some are very good. However, a lot of them are being underutilized. Then we have to look at the increase in bandwidth, because as we put more stress and strain on the infrastructure, then what do schools have to do? They have to increase the bandwidth, right? So there's an additional cost there. And then we have to look at, there's more human resources and capacity that needs to kind of support this whole increase in infrastructure. So again, I mean, I think it's, I don't have a silver bullet. I don't have a, yes, these are the funding streams, go take advantage of it. It's, let's be creative and innovative in how we procure and maintain and sustain this increase in infrastructure.
I love that you're talking about smarter procurement, because to me, that's where it all begins, right? And it begins with that longer term vision and planning. And what we've seen, like we've worked a lot to try and get things to scale. So, we work across all the carriers and we bring all those together, but we also work with 2,000 school districts, and we work with organizations like the Association of Education Purchasing Agencies, which for a lot of smaller school districts or school divisions, they may not have the negotiating power themselves to achieve effective scale and cost. And so working through, lead agencies in their state who are affiliated with national consortia for purchasing really brings down that cost. And then if they can plan a multi-year program, working with whoever their vendor is, whether it's us or some other topic entirely, that really helps that vendor then figure out how to build scale advantages and bring the cost down as well. So it's really important to think about that procurement and the longer term plan.
And Krystle, I just want to add one more thing. I'm a huge proponent of schools having partnerships with organizations, other entities, companies, any kind of company. I mean, in Virginia, we have a lot of technology companies in Virginia, especially in Northern Virginia. There's an opportunity for schools to not fly solo anymore, to cultivate some partnerships that can really, possibly help them with things like professional development, technical support, potentially some funding. We have Amazon in Virginia. We have, Amazon HQ too. So partnerships, I think, can also be a pretty important component of addressing the funding deficit that we're going to encounter here soon.
Awesome. Dr. Clair, while we're talking about funding and availability, I recently was looking, and I know that we had some conversation about Engage Virginia. Can you talk a little bit about what that looks like and how that can be of a support for districts, specifically in Virginia?
Yeah, so Engage Virginia is a new, it's a new initiative, and it's a pandemic recovery effort. So like every other state, Virginia's students have experienced a lot of learning loss during the pandemic. And so this initiative is to support students at no cost with coaching, individual instruction, consulting to help them with resumes, getting into higher education, mathematics, and reading support, and all that is at no cost. Again, it's funded by it's funded by the state. But I do want to make the point that we now have the infrastructure is in place to support Engage Virginia, and that's really important, because I would say like 5 years ago, there were schools that didn't have the infrastructure, but this helps us again with that. Students can learn anywhere. They can learn in school. They can learn on the bus. They can learn at home. And this program is probably going to be a program that continues outside of school. So they're going to need the technology to be able to connect.
It seems like it's a great program to assist with learning loss. And I know that we have some principals and educators on the call. So that is definitely something I think that if you're in Virginia, or even maybe checking with your state department just to see what is available. And we will drop a link in the chat for those that would like to take a moment to look at that at your leisure. So we're going to go ahead and head over to our next and final slide. This one is a big one. This is probably one of my favorite topics to talk about, because I know that with the availability of funds and just making sure that the key people are at the table to make those decisions, they can get the ball rolling and continue to move forward. So let's talk a little bit about how districts can plan ahead to ensure their sustainability needs will be met, whether it's technology inventory, whether it's developing a procurement plan for your district. What does that look like, and what advice would you as guests give our individuals on the call about that particular topic?
Well, I would just say, Krystle, that school leaders need to consider, like, what outcomes do you really want to see now that you have an increase in infrastructure? Do you want to address the learning loss? Is it math? Is it reading? Is it state standards tests? Is it college and career readiness? What outcomes do you want to see, and then work backwards from there? How are we going to get there? What outcomes do we really want to see? What partnerships do we need to bring in? What expertise do we need to bring in? Kajeet should be a partner in that discussion, especially if you have Wi-Fi on buses. So you got to know what your outcome is and then start to kind of move backwards and figure out what the strategy is going to be to meet those outcomes and to really think about all those different funding streams, and bring your procurement in, bring procurement in, finance. And so, we can't, I say this a lot for education, we can't fly solo anymore. We need more expertise and knowledge to bring to bear on a lot of this digital technology that we have now. It's just not computing devices. It's transportation, it's finance, it's HR systems. They've all gone digital. So one of my favorite sayings is the future has arrived faster than we expected. And so what are we going to do about it, right? So that's, that's my wisdom of how you would approach this.
Absolutely. Thank you. Michael, is there anything you'd like to share as we talk about how districts can plan ahead?
Sure. Yeah, no, I think it is all about that budgeting process and thinking, further downstream. So whether you're developing, portrait of a graduate concept for the different classes that you're going to graduate over the next, 5, 10, 12 years, thinking about what are the skills that you want those students to have when they graduate and they enter either higher education or maybe directly go into the workforce or go to a trade school or a community college. Like, what are the skills that you want them to have? And we're increasingly requiring more collaboration and digital platform and digital citizenship skills to be built into that core skill set of students. And so to support that, we need to give them the right technological environment, and the sustainability of that is really crucial. Sometimes there's also operational, technologies out there that are also migrating. So, an example of that is, the old analog phone network, what was described as plain old telephone service, right? POTS. Those are being shut down, right? So in August of last year, the FCC released the local exchange carriers and the CLECs from having to continue to provide those networks. And so they are gradually migrating everybody off those networks. In some states, they've been sending termination letters like, you must vacate by this date, because that network will be shut down. In other states, they're just raising the rates to kind of astronomically to encourage people to leave. So, we also have worked on a solution to migrate those old lines without changing any of the copper in the buildings, but to migrate those lines to digital, over mobile broadband, so that it saves money, but it also removes that issue of a potentially obsolete connection that is currently connecting those elevator phones and fire alarms and building security systems and just a lot of things that still connect to those systems. So whether you're thinking about student technology and making sure that students have the technology they need over, the sustainable longer term period, or whether you're thinking about operational technology used in the district, you've really got to be thinking, out ahead and getting ahead of these problems as things are just evolving so quickly.
Thank you. Thank you. Also, for those that are attending our webinar for today, we've actually put in the chat a couple of links that you can view at your leisure. For those that may not be aware, we provide here at Kajeet a running list of procurement vehicles. So we've listed that, and that is actually broken down by state. So you can look at that information, and that may help to guide your discussion within your district, or to help you to have a better knowledge of what's available within your particular state. So as we head over to our last and final slide, we have a few questions in the chat that I am going to share. One of those questions is directed specifically for you, Dr. Clair, and this question comes from one of our viewers that asks, can you provide examples of sustainable funding initiatives that you have created or supported? And this one is for Dr. Clair.
That I have funded or
that you have created or supported?
Yeah, I mean, back in 2020, 2021, I created the Vision program, which was the Virginia initiative to support schools outside of school initiative or network. Can't exactly remember the acronym, but gosh, that year I spent so much time on crafting guidelines for schools to apply for $18 million worth of funding that would go towards increasing the infrastructure in schools. And now my passion is around this very topic that we're talking about. It's been a thorn in my side now for a while of how are we going to get greater utilization out of the technology that we've purchased over the past several years? That's the question. How do we leverage and maximize it?
Awesome, awesome. Thank you so much for sharing that. And then our another question that we have is, I heard that Congress may yet fund the round 3 requests that were received but has not been funded yet. And I think this one is for Michael.
I can take it.
Yeah, you take it.
I can take this question. So, you know, obviously speculating on what Congress will or won't do is the hardest part. But what I can say is that the Emergency Connectivity Fund, which is what that round 3 references to, the Emergency Connectivity Fund was originally funded at $7.1 billion. To date, the FCC has actually only committed about $6.5 billion of that funding available. So there's still over $500 million that has not yet been committed. And you know, our biggest issue has really been the pace of those approvals. So currently, funding waves are coming out every 2 weeks. The funding wave that came out yesterday was only $24 million. So as you can imagine, if you do your math and they've got 500 something million dollars to give out and $25 million every 2 weeks, it's going to take them another 6 months to get that funding out the door. So they've really got to pick up the pace of those funding approvals. And then the second issue that that we are working with organizations like Shelby and Cozen and others to look at right now is the service delivery deadline for the ECF program. So currently for ECF 1 and 2, the service delivery deadline is June 30th of this year. And for ECF 3, the service delivery deadline is December 31st of this year. Well, as you can imagine, if you're only just now getting your funds approved, you can't get 12 months of service and have your service finish by December 31st of this year. So we're also working on trying to get those service delivery deadlines extended probably through the end of June 2024, so that applicants who received their funding approvals late or have yet to receive their funding approvals will actually be able to utilize the full funding that they originally applied for. That's another critical issue.
Awesome, awesome. So we have another comment in the chat, and this comment is, it says Virginia Public School grants to ensure sufficient internet bandwidth for standardized testing and a 5-to-1 student to computer ratio was created about 20 years with very rigid rules. The state grant, the hope is that the state grant will be updated with new goals and flexibility. And the question is, hopefully we can, what is the thoughts on hopefully states being encouraged to allow that flexible spending with the allocated grants money so that schools can kind of monetize that money more wisely?
You're talking about the VPSA funding, the Virginia Public School Authority funding. Yeah, I just inherited that from my colleague who's retiring. Yeah, it is a state funding source, and I neglected to to talk about that. But yeah, I mean that's a bond issued funding source, and it really is kind of rigid. You're exactly right in the way that it's structured, because the original idea was that that funding was needed to support SOL testing in Virginia, but it really hasn't, like you're saying, it really hasn't evolved into kind of a more modern funding stream to support today's technologies. It's something that I probably need to work on more, and I will do that, but I don't know how much headway I can make on that, because a lot of that funding source is connected to our Treasury Department. So, but thanks for your comment.
Absolutely, absolutely.
I'll just make a general comment around flexibility. You know, I'm a huge fan of flexibility, but it is a tricky topic. So ESSER, for example, that, there's still lots of ESSER funds out there, and they have a wide amount of flexibility and latitude in how ESSER funds can be used.
Yeah.
But I will say I've been doing this for many years. And I remember when another state, which I won't name because I think we're on recording here, but another state, basically provided total flexibility on how instructional material funds could be used, like your classic textbook funds. And the intention was that people would take the textbook funds, since they weren't buying textbooks anymore, and use them to buy digital curriculum and devices to enable that digital curriculum to be used. And instead, a lot of districts in that state went out and re-turfed their football fields. So too much flexibility can also be a problem sometimes.
Right.
But the right balance, I think, is really critical.
Yeah.
Right. And I also, when you're thinking about those availability of fundings, you always want to have in the back of your mind the audit process, because anything could be subjected to auditing. So just making sure that when you are using those funds, you read the deadlines, you read the information, you read what is provided, because it looks like it's great, but sometimes you definitely have to make sure that your inventory is solidified, make sure that you have documentation, you're keeping those mailing labels, you're keeping those shipping labels, because a lot of these funding sources, they're great, but there are some information that districts need to be aware of as they are applying for them to be able to have those funds to sustain their inventory and their network capabilities. So, well, I would like to thank Michael and Dr. Clair for joining us today. This has been a great discussion. Dr. Clair, we would love to have you and Michael back at some other time to talk a little bit more about funding and some other initiatives that are happening both state and nationwide. So thank you so much for being here with us. And we would like to thank all of our guests that also attended. At the conclusion of the webinar, this information will be shared with our guests so that they will have it. You can also view this webinar on our Kajeet YouTube page, as well as being able to have some direct links from our social media pages. We're on LinkedIn, Facebook, and Twitter. So thank you once again. This was episode 4 of Navigating the New Normal. I am Krystle Pearson, and we are signing off. Thank you.